With no further ado, I'd love to introduce Alex, who will be speaking on why Bitcoin matters for human rights. Alex Gladstein is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation and the Oslo Freedom Forum. In his work, Alex has connected hundreds of dissidents and civil society groups with business leaders, technologists, journalists, philanthropists, policymakers, and artists to promote free and open societies. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the generous intro. When I originally agreed to do this, I didn't realize it would be Bitcoin Pizza Day, which is a lot of fun. 10 years ago today, we have the first kind of recorded merchant activity in the Bitcoin world where a guy named Laszlo bought 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin, which today, of course, would be about $91 million. But it's a day that we celebrate in the Bitcoin community with regard to growth and certainly an eye for the future. So fun factoid. So I'm going to share my screen and present to you all today about why Bitcoin matters for human rights. I'm a human rights activist. I've been working for the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in New York since 2007. We focus on helping people who live under authoritarian governments around the world. And I have spent a lot of my career looking at how technology can either empower people or how it can oppress people. I remember the first thing I did at HRF as an intern actually was help get packages of sort of like forbidden books and movies into the Cuban underground library movement. And my colleagues who were Latin American, who could travel easily to Cuba at the time, they would take these backpacks that I would help put together on my summer internship. And they'd be packed with CDs that looked like music, but in reality, they were like Spanish dubbed or subtitled versions of films like V for Vendetta, Braveheart, etc. And they would bring them into these discussion groups in Cuba where people would host little powwows in their homes before people watch the movie, have a discussion about it. Several years later, this kind of turned into what is known as the paquete system, where some people were able to get satellite dishes in and just sort of download the equivalent of like Spanish Netflix and then share it in their communities. So it's a little easier to get outside information now. But yeah, I mean, it's a society that's, bans any books that aren't approved by the Communist Party. And we saw that information was a really powerful tool there. Later in my career, I spent a lot of time working with North Korean refugees and dissidents, doing similar things with regard to helping them get information back into the country that they left behind. We've floated information in on balloons. We've sponsored radio broadcasts and sent a lot of technology in, including tens of thousands of flash drives, USB keys, smartphones, and SD cards. And that's had a huge impact. I think each time someone from a closed information environment gets to see something like a book or a film, a movie, read a newspaper, it's got that kind of red pill effect. And you can prove that by just interviewing anyone who's fled. The vast majority of them were influenced by seeing some sort of glimpse of the outside world, whether it was through, again, like a radio broadcast or watching a movie, even if it was a soap opera or a sitcom, or even just footage of a supermarket in South Korea is so mind-blowing to somebody who lives in North Korea. So a lot of my career was focused on how technology can actually help promote human rights. But of course, I've also looked at what's happening in China and other dictatorships with regard to government's ability to take advantage of artificial intelligence, big data analysis, and do mass unprecedented social engineering on an epic scale. So that's kind of the situation that I am comfortable in and that I work in day to day. We study how to most effectively promote individual rights and freedoms. And, I've got this technology focus. And several years ago, I started looking more closely at financial freedom, financial repression. And in about 2016, someone approached me and basically said, hey, should we bring together some Bitcoiners with human rights activists? And I thought that was a cool idea. And we ended up doing a workshop a couple months later. And it's been, a long trip down the rabbit hole for me ever since. So my presentation today is just sort of an accumulation of some of the things that I've learned along the way and some of the things that I think are, up next for humanity, and why I think that Bitcoin in particular specifically is so important for us. So we'll start with this quote from Orwell that, of course, was a fiction, right? This idea that a government could monitor you so intensely that the only thing you owned was the words and ideas in your skull, in your head. And for a long time, that was just a dream. I mean, I know that many governments around the world, whether it was Mao's China or Castro's Cuba, or even the Stasi government in East Germany, have used plainclothes police and neighborhood informants to try and get a real-time understanding of what's happening, but they were, of course, limited. That desire has been quenched by technology. In China today and in other countries, the government can actually have a much more real-time understanding of what its citizens are doing. And that's only made possible through a social contract where citizens make a trade-off, where they actually trade off their privacy and freedom for convenience. It's very difficult to do with brute force. You have to kind of do it in a way where citizens give you information about them in exchange for something. And then this way you start to build this cloud database about them that can be analyzed, again, for social engineering projects, where you can start to sort of sort their activity, grade them, and start to incentivize them in different ways. This was not possible 3 decades ago. I mean, you didn't have the big data analysis possible. Like, I know we had credit cards, I know we had digital systems, but we didn't have the number crunching ability to actually do this at such a wide scale, to do mass surveillance. And, now we do. And, in general, I'm very, cognizant that there's this growing national security state, especially post 9/11 in the world, and regardless of what country you live in. And, it grows by feeding on the data that you reveal in your everyday life. And it might be benign to you, just going to the store and buying a coffee with a swipe. But, all of that, interaction has so much complexity in what it reveals to these servers and these clouds that are kind of feeding off of all of your interactions. And it really empowers governments to do things that they never have been able to do before. In particular, in the world's largest country, which we'll focus on, they use an app called WeChat, of course, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it, but it's more like an operating system, and more than 1 billion people use it every day for 4 or 5 hours on average. And as this young woman says, you can use it basically to do anything, to buy something in a rural village with a QR code, to book a hotel room, transport, pay bills, do your health checkups, check the weather, see what's going on. Everything can sort of be done in one, which is very convenient. I mean, most of us maybe on this call would use many, many, many different apps to do this. But you have to think about what you trade off when you get that convenience of using one app for everything. And what you end up doing is allowing the whole complexity of your life to be kind of like analyzed in a way where governments are going to start to try and track that, to try and incentivize you to be a good citizen, basically. So what we have here is just quickly run through the idea of social credit. Obviously, in America, we have this idea of a credit score, and that is based on your credit history, your financial health. What the Chinese government has done is said, hey, why don't we take that idea and actually add your behavior, your identity, your communications, and in general, your patriotism to that number, and let's make that a citizen score, right? And this is something they publicly announced in 2014 that they'd like to see be implemented across all of China. And, this has been, I would say, inflated and exaggerated a lot in the media in terms of the actual operational aspect of it. Like how rolled out is this? It's very unclear, and it's certainly not uniform across China. And there's certainly a lot of Kafkaesque, not Orwellian elements to it. Like, a lot of it just doesn't work well. But the design and the intention of the Chinese Communist Party is very clear. They want to have sort of this control over citizens in a way where, citizens want to police themselves in order to get certain benefits. So, if you want to send your kids to a good school, get a fast track visa, get a good rate on a loan, etc., which are all things that, people in China want, of course, you're not going to want to risk saying something bad about the government, because that could immediately hurt you, right? You don't want to end up in financial jail. It's worse than real jail. So across China today, there's many different experiments with this. Some are at the municipal level, some are done through companies. And in general, the government is pushing towards a near future where every citizen is on one of these kind of citizen score systems. And I think this is sort of obviously terrifying for civil liberties. And it's being kind of like, it's basically giving governments this ability that they never had before. And it's doing it with a sort of a partnership with the citizenry, again, where you trade off stuff. You may not realize what you're giving up, and you're really empowering this huge surveillance state. There's a lot of different ways this manifests itself across society. Here's an intersection in a busy Chinese city where people who are jaywalking get put up on a giant screen with their information to kind of shame them. So there's a lot of sort of carrot and sticks element here. The government would rather rule with a velvet glove than an iron fist. I mean, it's very expensive to go beat the crap out of everybody, and it's not good for the PR of the government. They don't want to do that unless they have to do that. They would much rather you police yourselves. There's a good research piece that came out on this this year in one of the big political science journals, but this is sort of the intended outcome, is that you sort of police yourself in this kind of system. And, this sort of carrots and sticks incentivization or disincentivization is something they're experimenting with. Here's another, concept they're playing with in a large city of about 10 million people. When you look down at your phone and look at what's happening around you, citizens that have a bad score are like flagged. They're scarlet lettered, right? So you wouldn't want to go near them because you might get a bad score yourself. So everything's sort of connected in that way. And the idea here, obviously, is not just people who are financially untrustworthy, but dissidents, poets, ethnic minorities. We want to make them pariahs, right? Social pariahs. And this is all being done with a dramatic increase of facial recognition. So this policewoman in China is wearing, essentially surveillance glasses, and China said that they're going to have 500 million plus of these things, of cameras in general, by the end of next year. That's one for every 2 to 3 people. And when you look out through these glasses, we've seen through tech expos what kind of stuff is available on the other side. So this is like one example from a tech company that it was pitching its wares to the Chinese Communist Party, where it's like, hey, we can show you like all this information about citizens and the vehicles. If you actually look at the cars and trucks, there's like additional vehicles information there. And I think by the end of this year, they want every single vehicle to have like an RFID chip. So this is really the omniscient state that Orwell was talking about, kind of manifesting itself through centralized technology. And it's really being pushed to the fore now by the government response to COVID, where, to get out of some of these areas that have been in lockdown, whether it's like Wuhan or Hubei province, et cetera, even in the big cities, you've got to show an app that says you're either, green or amber or red. And if you're not green, your travel is very restricted. You may not be able to go to work or get on the subway, or even leave your building, right? And it's important to note that this color coding, which I would say is like the next frontier of social engineering, is not biometric. It's not like your app is listening to your body and understanding like what's going on underneath your skin. It's some authority somewhere else is giving you this color. And there's been a lot of like, again, Kafka-esque moments where, there's people who are reporting and filming videos and uploading them where they're like, hey, my phone says I'm red and hers says she's green and she's in the same room as me and her color is not changing. So we're really not sure what drives the colors for a lot of these systems. But again, we understand their desire and what they want, even if they're not there yet with the actual proficiency. And I think young Chinese people are very aware of this, and obviously it's a sort of a dilemma where they don't know whether they're constructing a future society or a cage. And I think that's a very poignant way of putting it. And I think when you strive for this omniscient government to solve all of our problems, and the Chinese government has called this a harmonious society that they will oversee, where kind of all the rough edges are blurred out and we have this beautiful harmony across all living things. The reality is we have to look at the whole picture. We understand the glittering infrastructure projects that they've built. We also have to understand what the underbelly is, what else is going on. And if you look deep enough, you'll see, for example, satellite images of prison camps in northwestern China, where more than 1 million Muslim minority Uyghurs are imprisoned even today. The real number is hard to know because there's no independent media in that part of the country. But the UN said that it was more than 1 million. And just to give you a scale, a scope, in World War II, the Nazi German government had at its peak 715,000 Jews and other minorities in these camps that they ran. And I'm not comparing the type of camp, but just to give you a human scale comparison, there's more prisoners in China's network of gulags today. So it's a huge humanitarian issue, and it is really something that I think comes part and parcel with the quest for omniscience, right? And this is not just a problem for Chinese citizens; it's a problem for everybody. This is a New York Times investigation showing all the governments of countries which have purchased or are purchasing Chinese surveillance technology. So whether that's telecom stuff, 5G stuff, or street level surveillance, and you look around and it's a lot. It's Mexico, Bolivia, Mauritania, Spain, Germany, the UK, Turkey, Russia, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Egypt. I mean, Indonesia. This is some very global reach that they have as part of their Belt and Road infrastructure project, which is the Chinese government's play to create, basically a global physical and information infrastructure arrangement that the rest of the world has to be subservient to. And it's as a project, it's way bigger than the Marshall Plan in kind of like real dollar terms. It's something like the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II, was something like $150 billion or something. When all was said and done, the Chinese government has already given out the equivalent of $400 billion in loans and investments. So, we're talking a really, really massive project here, and this kind of tech is going to come to you no matter where you are. And Yuval Noah Harari, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, a popular historian, said this, and I thought it was quite on the money, that if you just like the idea of living in a digital dictatorship, like the kind that the Chinese authorities are trying to build, then the most important contribution you can make is to find ways to prevent too much data from being concentrated in too few hands. These will not be easy tasks, but achieving them may be the best safeguard of democracy. And I think this is really important for finance, actually. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the talk on, because I think when we transact with each other, when we pay for things, sell things, it reveals a tremendous amount about us. And the increasing centralization of money and payments and finances is sort of very core to this idea of government omniscience. And what's playing right into that is this idea of the cashless society. So today, cash is disappearing. When I say cash, I mean paper or metal money. These are numbers from 2018, but for example, in the United Kingdom, only 42% of transactions were cash. In the US, 32%, Sweden, 20%, South Korea, less than 15%. The real numbers are lower than this. This is from 2018, but it gives you an idea and an affirmation that the cash is definitely disappearing in some places that I'm sure many of you have been to. Beijing, Stockholm, Caracas, like for different reasons, you don't use cash at all. So that sort of idea of all money being digital is already here. And we have this upcoming looming war on cash that we've already seen in different manifestations. So we've seen, according to the World Health Organization, they were talking about how in early March, dirty banknotes may be spreading the coronavirus. And later they came out and said, well, we didn't really mean that. But it's something that the Chinese government was doing. They were demonetizing in February. You've had the Indian government demonetize. You've had many governments demonetize for different reasons. I'd be surprised if, by 2035, if cash was even legal in most countries. So I think there's going to be a big war on cash. And when we think about cash disappearing, we have to think about the implications of that kind of society where all money's like digitally centralized. We have to think about what happens when we lose financial privacy. And we have to think about, when we make that trade-off, what powers do states or corporations gain? And the underlying thought here is that what you buy says more about you than your words. Like if I really wanted to spy on you and know your habits, I'd rather see your credit card statement than your text messages. And we live in a society that came from a place where it was legally and morally the norm to buy things anonymously, more or less. Like when you would go to the store and use cash to buy something, the merchant doesn't know anything about you. They don't even know your name, where you live, your email address. They don't know any of that. And that was, again, legally, morally fine. And that was actually quite important to check government power. Now, as I've been saying, the advancement of big data analysis and fintech is changing that, right? So when you make a transaction now with a credit card, or you swipe with a touchless payment, or even a wearable, you're revealing this huge amount of information about yourself. And it's in different ways, and some of it's very much on the private side, depending on what country you live in. Some of it goes right to the government, let's say if you live in China. But you're revealing a lot about your habits and your identity when you buy stuff now in a way that you just didn't before. And this is a huge transition. I mean, what we're really watching is money transform from a bearer asset that provides privacy to a surveillance and control mechanism. And there is competition for getting in on that, obviously, not just governments, but also private companies. You've seen everybody from traditional banks to Apple to Facebook try and sort of hint at or unroll programs where they want to be more involved in the money business and in the payment business. So even social media companies are getting in the mix here. And it's kind of interesting to look at the arguments where you have two arguments that I think are very valid. You have Zuckerberg saying that, look, like the current system doesn't work for folks. And I would agree with him. And then on the other hand, you have the US government saying, hey, like, given how sketchy Facebook is on all these issues, do we really want them like involved so at the base level of the financial system? So I think both point of views are interesting, and there's going to be this fight between corporate money and state money moving forward. And my question to you, I guess, is, could we have a different kind of cashless society? Could there be a third option, which is digital, but also decentralized without third parties and without the control of authorities? And what's interesting, again, when you think about the evolution of money, is that the answer seemed to be no. Like, that's not the direction we were going in, right? We were going from barter economies to using things like shells, precious gems, to precious metals with kings' faces stamped on them in coins, to paper money, to credit cards that indicated ownership of paper money somewhere, to phones, to wearables, and ultimately to chips under our skin, which is where we're headed, is how we're going to pay and transact for things. And again, this is this sweeping evolution of money transforming from a bearer asset that didn't reveal anything about you to something that was intimately tied to you and is sort of this instrument of control and surveillance. And, luckily, in late 2008, early 2009, some group of people came up with another option, came up with another way to do digital payments, and that is Bitcoin. And as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, I just want to highlight how important that particular element of Bitcoin is. Like today, when you make a digital payment, and again, we agree that all payments are eventually going to be digital, think about all the intermediaries that are between you and the other person. You've got, your bank, whether it's PayPal, Visa, Venmo, the Chinese apps, if you're there, Brazilian apps, Russian apps, no matter where you are, maybe it's Stripe, maybe it's, Plaid or whatever. There's so many different processors and people who help make your transaction possible. Probably no fewer than 3 or 4. And each one is a possibility for censorship, surveillance, confiscation, freezing, devaluation, all these different things. And with Bitcoin, we have a different model, completely different paradigm, where there is nobody in the middle. There's no entity between you and the person you're paying. There's a decentralized competition which processes your payment, and there's no party in the middle collecting much or anything. And if you actually look at the data on the Bitcoin blockchain, your name is not in there, and neither is your address or anything about you. It is a pseudonymous system, and that's really important when we kind of think about the future and think about how we can protect ourselves against this growing surveillance state. So I like to think, as a student personally of democracy and human rights, I've obviously studied the impact democracy has had as a tool, as a technology that humans have used to decentralize government away from tyranny. No matter what you wanted to call it, no matter what form it took, you had a world where pre-Cleisthenes in ancient Greece, every society was ruled by rulers in some way. And then he came up with this idea that we should be ruled by rules instead, right? By rules. And we've been chipping away at that idea ever since. And today it's amazing to look at, almost half the world is ruled by some sort of decentralized government where you have a balance of powers, and you have special interest groups competing with a free press, competing with citizen control of the military, competing with a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch. So we really took this idea of decentralizing government and realized it could make our societies thrive, right? In the same way, information has been a progressive force to watch, where it used to be totally centralized and only for the elite. Like if you wanted to know everything about the world 2,000 years ago, you had to somehow get into the Library of Alexandria or something like that, right? And then through the printing press, radio, the television, now the internet, the means of production of information and the ability to have a voice have been decentralized, where now almost everybody can have, in their pocket, access to almost all the world's knowledge. So we've seen successfully people open government and open information. And my personal theory is that I think Bitcoin is sort of the third step in this progressive trinity, where you're going to have people be able to open money, and decentralized, digital, and scarce. And we've talked so far about why being decentralized is important, not having a single point of failure. And obviously the idea that all money is going to be digital. But what about scarcity? I mean, I think that's the piece that a lot of people miss, and what's so critical about Bitcoin. If we think about gold and why gold is so important to humans as money, a really interesting fact is that in 350 BC Babylon, 1 ounce of gold got you about 350 loaves of bread. In 2019 AD San Francisco, 1 ounce of gold gets you about 350 loaves of bread. So it's really amazing to see the store of value that gold has had over time. And that's because it's scarce. There's no such thing as alchemy. You can't make gold out of anything else. You have to dig it up out of the ground. It's very expensive and time consuming. And only a small amount of gold comes into the market every year on top of the existing supply. And I think when Satoshi made Bitcoin and launched it in January 2009, and when they put into the Genesis block, the first block of the Bitcoin blockchain, they put this political statement, which was a headline in a British paper about the ability of easy money to bail out, problematic actors, was something that what Satoshi was very critical of. And back in the 18th century, there was this economist named Richard Cantillon, and he pointed out this idea that when the state prints money, the closer you are to power, the more you're going to benefit. And the further away you are, the more you're going to get harmed. So he said fiat money is not neutral. And, this is just sort of vividly on display now. I mean, if you think about what's happening now, where you have governments around the world trying to save the economy by growing their balance sheets and buying assets off the private sector. I mean, who's getting bailed out first, right? I mean, obviously companies are getting bailed out before individuals. A lot of people I know haven't even gotten their stimulus yet. Meanwhile, stock prices are at an all-time high in a lot of cases, right? So when we talk about things to bring home about Bitcoin that I would want to impart, I have 4 for you. And yeah, the first one is this idea of a predictable money supply, which is very much tied to the idea of scarcity, and that Bitcoin is this first decentralized digital scarce asset. I mean, you can't overstate the importance of that it was created as an alternative to central banks, right, ultimately. And Satoshi was critical of their ability to arbitrarily determine money issuance. And of course, this power is often abused by the elite at the expense of the rest. In Bitcoin, however, we know the monetary supply sticks. Second thing to dwell on would be the permissionless nature of Bitcoin. Anybody can use Bitcoin without asking permission from a government or a company. You don't need to have a state ID or have a passport or a bank account to earn or receive Bitcoin. And I think this is so incredibly powerful, given that billions of people either don't have a bank account, aren't banked, don't have an ID, or live under some sort of financial repression. So this permissionless feature is absolutely critical. Third thing is censorship resistance, and this is super important for human rights. So if you want to send me Bitcoin, nobody can censor that transaction, right? Again, payment processing is done through this global competition, not by an entity. As a result, if I'm a media outlet or a civil society organization or a human rights group and you're a repressive government, you can't stop me from receiving donations. And the fourth one would be confiscation resistance. So, if you want to move your Bitcoin, you need to use a private key, which today, basically can consist of 24 English words written down, which you can split apart, disguise, memorize. You can program them into multi-signature arrangements so that numerous parties have to agree before the keys can be input and the funds can move. This makes Bitcoin much more difficult for authorities to locate and confiscate than any other asset, especially any other centralized digital asset, which can be seized at the central point. But even physical decentralized assets like gold, for example, are prone to confiscation, as we've seen. Most gold in the world is owned by governments, of course, and central banks. So for all these reasons, I think that as we look out to the future of money, we've got obviously state money, which I think will always exist. Governments will always issue debt, and there'll always be a price for that. We're going to have corporate money, and you're going to have more and more, I think, corporate actors getting into the mix in the future. And yes, of course, today they're pegging their currencies to government money, to fiat money, but that may not be the case in 20, 30 years. This idea of corporate money that we've seen in books like Snow Crash, I think may very well come to fruition. In fact, I would argue that almost every other cryptocurrency beyond Bitcoin is corporate money, is designed by a company or a foundation, which has basically total control over that. And these corporate monies will become more popular. And then we have the people's money, which I think is Bitcoin, which to me is not centralized. It's not controlled by any one particular entity. And I think that's so incredibly powerful. When I look at this from my work, I've realized that maybe 60, 70 million people around the world have ever used Bitcoin, probably less than that meaningfully, in a way where they actually own their own Bitcoin. So the opportunity is massive. And as I mentioned before, you've got 2 billion that don't have a bank or an ID, where they are being fenced off from the rest of the world, right? And then 4 billion plus that live under authoritarianism. According to HRF, my organization, about 4.3 billion people live under some sort of authoritarian government around the world today. So if you think about what Bitcoin makes possible, all that stuff I talked about with regard to the Chinese government trying to become omniscient, well, if you opt out into Bitcoin, Xi Jinping cannot do the same sort of micro tracking. If you opt out, Putin can no longer freeze your bank account. This is something he likes to do to human rights groups, activists, journalists. You can't do that. The Burmese government and others around the world like to sort of delete the identities of ethnic minorities, right, to disempower them. Well, they can't delete their ability to receive Bitcoin. All you need is a smartphone and access to the internet. And even my government, of course, does bad things around the world, like sanction entire countries. And if you actually think about it, what did the average 23-year-old Iranian do? She couldn't even vote for her government. It's a dictatorship. Why shouldn't she be able to get an iPhone, right? So I think there's also a lot of injustice that happens from that perspective. Now she could work as a software engineer and earn income, by routing around the system. And then, of course, you have the horror of hyperinflation. And look, I know that hyperinflation is rare, but that doesn't really help comfort a Venezuelan. And there was 30 million of them before they started to flee their country. And, we're talking tens of millions of people here around the world who are either living in a place like Venezuela or who have left a place like that, or Iran, or a place like Somaliland or Zimbabwe. I mean, there are significant numbers of humans who've had to deal with this. And when you look at hyperinflation, this is just an example a friend gave me, and she was saying it was like 450 bolivars in 2016 in Caracas for her to get a cup of coffee, and 4,500 the next year, and 1.4 million the next year. And look, this is really bad for the poor and the middle class. It just vaporizes their savings. If you're wealthy, you can do things like, and this was common, like people would take out a loan from the government of Venezuela in bolivars, and they would immediately turn around and buy a property in Miami. And they would watch as their mortgage could disappear. So, I mean, if you're in the upper middle class or at the top, you can get around hyperinflation. But for most people, it's just the absolute vaporization of their time and energy, right? And, beyond that, as people tried to escape, the government built, ways for them to stay in. They built basically a jail, and they prevented things coming in and coming out. So this is an image from about a year and a half ago where the Venezuelan government was like blocking off highways to prevent aid from coming into the opposition. But what you don't see here is the millions of Bitcoin going back and forth, right, that they can't control anymore. So I do think that this idea that governments can sort of control financial resources is going to go on the dustbin of history eventually. Another example, I have a friend in Iran, his name's Zia, and there's a lot of accounts on the internet that love making fun of Bitcoin. People love to make fun of Bitcoin. So one of them here was saying there's nothing that Bitcoin can do that Apple Pay can't do already way better, right? And my friend is basically just like, look, I live in Iran. I can't use any of these technologies that you have the luxury of using, but I can use Bitcoin. What do you have to say to that, right? So the critic didn't respond to that one. But that's really where Bitcoin shines, is where everything else fails, right? And I wanted to unpack, to sort of conclude here on the civil liberties front, something that Nassim Nicholas Taleb has said about Bitcoin's mere existence giving us, the crowd, an insurance policy against an Orwellian future. And I thought this image is a great way of explaining this. This is an image my friend Mary took last summer. She's a journalist in Hong Kong, of people lining up in the subways, in the metro, to pay for one-time use top-up cards to use the metro system. Now, normally they wouldn't do this. They would use their Octopus card, which is like an Oyster card or a Metro card. And in many cases, especially for students, it's tied to your identity. So when these students last summer were going to protest, they didn't want the authorities of the metro system to be able to give their whereabouts and the fact that they got off at a protest point to their school authorities or their employers, because they could get fired or worse, right? So they lined up in masks, of course, and they used cash to buy these one-time use tickets, and they had freedom, and they could go and protest more or less in a way that held their government accountable. And you have to think about this idea of financial privacy and how important it is, especially in urban environments, for holding governments accountable. And, like, that's our insurance policy. Today is cash, but in the future, when we don't have cash, we know, whether we want it or not. I'm a big cash advocate, but we know governments will take away cash. What are we going to have left, right? And that's why Bitcoin's so important. I really do believe it can help people transact freely without permission and without leaving this big digital footprint behind, right? So if we want to fight Big Brother, decentralized money is key. If it fails, we know which model is going to win. I've already gone over this model, but this model of increasing centralization of all of your information and whereabouts and behaviors to these servers, which will be run by algorithms and authorities, and that is the alternative. So it's fairly stark. But if Bitcoin survives and thrives, humans have money and a base layer protocol that does a lot more than just money. I mean, that allows for payments and messaging and all kinds of things that can't be censored by authorities, that can't be devalued by governments, that can't be monopolized by corporations, that can't be easily mass surveilled, that can't be stopped by borders, and that can be used by anybody. And I think that's incredibly important. In fact, I think that this coming century is the new space race is going to be a monetary space race for the dominant currency. And obviously the dollar is way out ahead of everybody else. I mean, the euro is there, but when you look at the fact that people talk a lot about the RMB and the Chinese government's plan to compete, but right now the RMB is 2 to 3% of foreign exchange reserves, international transactions. They've got a long way to go, but you never know. I mean, that could change, or some other country could come along, but that could change. And this is going to be this space race for kind of control of the world, I would say. And it's nice to know that there's another option for everybody, that anybody can access, that isn't controlled by those governments, no matter what they do. And that's kind of reassuring for a human rights advocate like me. So I'll close with this quote from Buckminster Fuller: "You never change things by fighting." That's what it's trying to do, is actually obsolete the financial system, provide a completely new paradigm. And I think that's helpful for differentiating Bitcoin from all the other pretty much cryptocurrency projects. Like, the second most popular thing in cryptocurrency is a stable coin, right? This idea we can make a stable coin or an algorithmic stable coin. Well, all that's doing is, at best, even if it works, a modest improvement on the existing system. It's still part of the financial legacy system, right? So we're talking about making a whole new model that doesn't work with this, goal of expanding government power and knowledge and control. So Bitcoin really does give us a way out, and that's why it matters for human rights.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Like I said at the beginning of our conversation, if you would like to reach out to us, you can do that at 1517fund.com/take action. And Alex, you're just at Gladstein on Twitter, right?
Yeah. So join me there and hit me up, send me a DM or email me, okay?
Yeah, if you guys want to follow Alex, I suggest you go ahead and do that. You can also follow 1517 Fund, just at 1517 Fund. If you'd like any more updates about future conversations like this one this evening. Thanks, everyone. Thanks
Thanks,
Alex.
everybody. Take care.